So billions of nodules are sitting 4.5 kilometers under the ocean surface on the seabed. Enter the Metals Company. That's literally what they're called, the Metals Company, TMC. They're a Canadian-based company founded to do one thing, which is to harvest these nodules, which, as you will see, is incredibly controversial.
So this is what it looks like with light shone on it.
I've been talking with the CEO of TMC to try to understand how they plan on even doing this. He's been showing me imagery of how they send these huge vacuums down to the sea floor to suck these nodules up.
You can see how the nodules get sort of plucked off the surface.
Now, TMC is not allowed to harvest these nodules yet. No one is. So what they've been doing for the last 10 plus years is investing $500 million in preparing, in researching, in developing technology, and undergoing all of the complicated rules and requirements necessary to start this harvesting. To fuel all this investment, they went public on Wall Street a while back. They raised more money. But the way capitalism works is when you raise money from investors, those investors want a return. TMC has a lot of pressure to make money off of this venture that they've sunk $500 million into. How much money is down there, if you were to translate that into dollars?
I've heard estimates of something like $16 trillion.
Now, these nodules have been down there for millions of years, as we saw, but only recently have they become super valuable. And for this, I turned to my friend Joss.
There are nodules down there. They're basically lumps of metal that are sitting in the dark on the floor of the ocean. The nodules are valuable because they contain nickel, cobalt, copper, and manganese. Nickel and manganese are used mostly in steel production. Copper is in basically all of our electronics, and cobalt is actually used in jet engines and like our phone and laptop batteries. But the reason why there's a lot of urgency around this right now is that all 4 of those metals are currently used to build electric cars. What's attractive to mining companies is that it's kind of like you get 4 mines for the price of 1 because you've got 4 big metals that you can sell into markets.
We need more of these metals. We need billions of tons more of these metals. And so the question that society has to answer is, where are we going to get them from? And what will be the impact of getting them, both to the environment and to the people living on the planet? This
is not about we need these metals and we can't find them anywhere else. This is about whether we want to have another source of the metals as they expect the demand to continue in the future.
So you've got TMC and a couple dozen other mostly government subsidized companies out there in this zone where there's a ton of these nodules preparing to harvest them, but they can't yet. They're really close to being able to go down there, but they can't yet for 2 main reasons. The first is that we're not sure what damage this will do to this ecosystem that we've just barely started studying.
They are putting down harvesters, those heavy machinery that will just scrape the bottom of the ocean.
You know, anything that gets sucked up with the nodules will die.
What happens if humans start kicking up storms of sediment?
There's going to be a cloud of dust.
Oh, there's creatures that live on the nodules. Clouds of dust?
Dust clouds.
Cloud of mud, a cloud of sediment.
Behind this collector vehicle.
Noise
pollution.
A bunch of artificial sound where it's been totally silent forever.
That's a vast area to expose to a new industrial activity.
Vibrations introduced into the ecosystem. A plume.
The plumes.
The plumes.
Plume flows.
Plumes coming from
the discharge from the ship.
Doesn't sound good.
That ecosystem is going to be impacted.
And then there's all of the microbes.
Oh, a bunch of microbes.
You know, there's big
microbial
communities inside
the sediment
that play a role in, you know, how our carbon cycle works, actually.
Carbon absorption.
Oh, and this is a carbon sink.
The oceans absorb about 25% of the carbon that we pump into the atmosphere.
Usually when humans mess with things, we find that one thing triggers another that we didn't anticipate. This is an untouched part of the world. We don't have a lot of those left. Going, you know, 4,000 meters down to mess with that after everything that we've already done. There are creatures that live directly on the nodules. So every time these researchers go down there to take a look.
How do they even research all this stuff in the dark?
They're basically coming back with some new, cool-looking invertebrate that no one has ever named or seen before.
My God, the creatures down here are wild-looking.
These aren't things with faces.
Things like corals and sponges and sea anemones.
Translucent and slow-growing.
Whoa. Squid worms, gummy squirrels. Sounds like a candy.
And all kinds of weird and interesting fish and other sorts of creatures.
We haven't found these anywhere else on the planet.
And so the idea of possibly destroying some of them before we've even known them, I think rubs a lot of biologists the wrong way.
Okay, yeah, there's a lot going on down there. I mean, it's not a lot of density of life, but the complexity, diversity, and potential domino effects here are not well understood and potentially way bigger than first meets the eye. It's not just a desert down there. But there's another reason why companies aren't allowed to start mining the nodules yet, and it has to do with who gets the money. There's a lot of value in these little metal balls, and the question is, who has the right to exploit them for profit? Back in the old days, the answer to that question was easy. Whoever was the most powerful and technologically capable country would just go down and take all the resources. But our modern world is one of international laws. However weak they sometimes are, we have a framework for deciding what we do with a patch of ocean like this. A patch of ocean that, by the way, doesn't belong to any one country. This is basically the rule book for how the law of the sea should work. It's called UNCLOS, the UN Convention Law of the Sea. This treaty that the entire world has signed, besides a few countries, including the United States, who doesn't like to be constrained by international organizations, says that anything found in this water is the common heritage of mankind. It belongs to everyone. It's the world's resource. And to that end, any money made off of this should benefit everyone. The benefit of mankind as a whole is the verbatim language. If a rich country wants to go out here and explore for nodules, they have to explore not just the area they want, but an additional area that has nodules in it that will be reserved for a developing country. This frankly took me a minute to get my head around how it actually works. And here's Mariana drawing a graphic during one of our calls to help explain it. The point is, if you're a developing country, you are entitled to one of these reserved areas that's already been explored by a rich country, but you are entitled to exploit it. Okay, that sounds like leveling the playing field. The other big rule is anyone who goes down here into this part of the ocean that the whole world owns and exploits it and makes money off of it has to pay a bunch of that money to the International Seabed Authority, who then distributes it out to all of the member countries, which is another way that developing countries are supposed to get in on the riches of the ocean, even if they don't mine it themselves. The other big rule here that affects Nauru and TMC, and you'll see why in a second, is that if a corporation like TMC wants to go out here and harvest all these nodules and make a bunch of money, they can't just do that on their own. They need to be sponsored by a country that is a member of this treaty. It's like 170 of them. That country has to be their partner. The corporation can't just do it alone. The sponsor country is very important and stands to benefit from this relationship, but also has a big responsibility to regulate the corporation, to make sure that they're following all the rules, that they are making sure that it doesn't destroy the environment. Okay, so that is how this is supposed to work. That is how this treaty says that the nodules and any resources we find in this international water is to benefit all mankind and level the playing field for developing countries. But those rules are currently being stress tested. So TMC really wants these nodules, but they're gonna have to play by all these international rules we've talked about. And one of those rules is that they need a sponsor. The corporation can't just go out and do this on their own. They need a country to sponsor them. And remember how developing countries are entitled to these reserved patches of already surveyed ocean floor? Well, TMC made the rational business decision, and instead of choosing its home country of Canada to sponsor them, they chose 3 developing countries, these 3 tiny island nations. Tonga, Kiribati, and one country whose story you know very well now, a desperate and exploited island nation who is looking for their next potential economic miracle.
By getting a developing country, and in this case Nauru, to sponsor them for an exploration licenses that they would be guaranteed nodule-rich areas without having to go look for any nodules whatsoever.
So here are all the countries that are out here. Most of these, again, are state-run enterprises. And here are all the patches of ocean that TMC has been allocated, thanks to their sponsors. It's nearly half of the reserved areas that have been allocated to developing countries. So they're all out here surveying, preparing, doing a bunch of research, while the ISA is finalizing the regulations, the environmental protections that any mining operation needs to follow. They can't mine yet. They're getting close, but they can't yet.
So this is what it looks like with light shone on it.
Well, geez, there's a lot of them.
Yeah.
The whole point of this sponsorship arrangement is it's a layer of accountability for TMC. Nauru is liable to keep TMC compliant with any environmental regulations in mining the deep sea. So Nauru is required to have enough people and experts and infrastructure to be out there, checking in on their operation, visiting them out of the blue to make sure that they're complying. It's a big job and it's an important job. If they don't do it, they could be screwed if TMC doesn't comply and someone else catches them. The ISA emphasizes this point over and over. They say that the sponsoring country must have effective control over the company. Effectively controlled. It says this everywhere. You can't kick them out of the driver's seat. Effective control just means that Nauru has to be in the driver's seat on how this goes down. Effective control, I swear, I've been hearing the word effective control as I fall asleep at night because I have been looking at so many documents about the definition and interpretation of what effective control means. What does it really mean for Nauru to effectively control this big Canadian corporation?
All the issues somehow go back to effective control.
There's no international police force in the high seas, and so effective control is the mechanism we will use to make sure that the big corporation doesn't destroy the ecosystem. The sponsors are responsible for this. Nauru is responsible for this. Now, Jared insists to me that despite Nauru being this tiny country, they have effective control over TMC. But others worry that this relationship is actually a recipe for disaster.
The main reasons that TMC went to Nauru to sponsor it was, number one, it would not be able to exercise effective control over the activities of TMC.
Now, here's what's tricky is that TMC hasn't broken any rules here. But the reason why the ISA raises this idea of sponsorship of convenience is because they're worried that a big corporation like TMC gets sponsored by Nauru and that Nauru won't actually be able to hold them to account.
Do you think Nauru has the capacity to effectively monitor and regulate TMC the way they should as a sponsoring nation?
Well, at the moment, I think they are pretty weak in that sense. They've not set obligations in their sponsorship agreement.
Pradeep Singh is really deep in all of this. He's sort of the bullseye expert for this very topic. So Mariana posed the question to him.
At the moment, it's just about getting their sponsorship and doing the minimum possible domestically, but really not being the type of sponsoring state that would actually go out there, conduct surprise visits. It does not have the capacity to be a proactive regulator.
So Jared says that this is effective control. Pradeep says it's not. The best way to answer this question would be to talk to the government of Nauru. Yeah, they won't talk to us.
It's basically impossible to get a hold of Nauruans.
SEC filings, to the agreement between TMC and Nauru, to the lawsuit where TMC investors sued the company for misleading claims. All of this paints a picture of a corporation who is not giving up much control at all to little Nauru. And of course they're not. We should assume that TMC's lawyers are going to do their job and protect TMC as much as they possibly can without violating the rules. Just like an accountant tries to get you the maximum tax return you possibly can, going right up to the line without crossing it. This is rational behavior. And because effective control is up to interpretation, lawyers could argue that Nauru does have effective control. Not to mention, Nauru, by its own free will and choice, entered into this agreement with TMC. They calculated that this was worth it to them. No one twisted their arm. But the picture this all paints to me is not the effective control that the ISA envisioned, which could spell a lot of trouble for Nauru if TMC does break the rules and Nauru doesn't catch it.
Let's think about the benefits that Nauru are getting. We took this opportunity to Nauru to allow them to have a participation in it. And so, the benefits will include, as I outlined, jobs, training opportunities, royalties, and taxation. So those benefits are going to be quite enormous.
I actually went into this interview kind of pushing Jared on whether or not Nauru itself will actually benefit from this relationship. And I'm actually convinced that they will to some degree. Again, they don't have a lot of options. What being in all these documents has done for me, though, is created a much bigger worry about the system as a whole. This international framework that was meant to safeguard this part of our world that belongs to all of us. I worry that a relationship like this, yes, it might benefit both parties, but it might lead to substantial harm harm, irreparable harm, to a part of our marine environment that we don't really understand. And I'm not even saying that I think TMC will commit this harm. It's more that it sets a precedent on how this should work. My biggest worry is one shared by the former ISA representative from Belgium, who told the New York Times that TMC is relying on a legal loophole here. They've chosen a tiny island nation to gain access to the reserved areas. It is exactly the opposite of what the law of the sea intended. And I've been focusing a lot on TMC because they are like the biggest private company here, but there's other private companies too. There's 4 private companies, all 4 of them based in rich countries. And 3 of them have partnered with developing nations, which gets them in on an already explored patch of ocean. Like Jamaica, the Cook Islands. I mean, the Cook Islands has 15,000 people. It's a teeny tiny country. And they will be responsible for regulating and having control over these private corporations, raising concern that these companies are choosing these small nations as sponsors of convenience. The rest of the companies out here are state-owned enterprises from rich, powerful countries. So there's a lot of critique that the way that this deep sea mining stuff is playing out is like not actually in the spirit of the treaty.
It's a complete corruption of the vision that the negotiators in the 1970s had about something that was going to benefit everybody, something that would allow an equal opportunity for all countries to benefit from and to get involved in, and that simply ain't happening.
We live in a world that needs a lot more of these metals. It's a lot of countries that are going to need lots of steel, a lot of electronics, and then of course the bazillion electric car batteries that we need to make to decarbonize our transportation. This has to come from somewhere. And a really valid point that TMC often argues is that currently where nickel, for example, comes from looks like this. This is Indonesia. It's home to this rich, biodiverse rainforest that is currently being destroyed to make way for these massive mines. These things are growing very quickly.
We're having to go and destroy, we're choosing to go and destroy those ecosystems, push out the indigenous people living amongst them to be able to dig up that rainforest, move it aside to look for the metals containing the nickel, particularly, which is what this resource is very rich in.
I kind of agree with the CEO of the metals company that land-based mining is a worse way for us to get our minerals. It has lots of problems, toxic pollution. It happens where people live, and often the poorest people are the ones that have to deal with the pollution. It's cutting down trees that suck up carbon. They're processing the nickel in Indonesia with power from coal-fired power plants. So, sometimes the quality of those minerals is lower, which requires more energy to process it. There's lots of problems with terrestrial-based mining.
A major talking point for TMC is that we need to be less precious and slow about this place where there isn't as much life, less precious about the worms and the sponges living 5 kilometers under the ocean, and start harvesting these nodules sooner. It's less destructive than doing it in Indonesia. And in a world where harvesting the nodules would significantly slow down or even stop terrestrial mining in Indonesia, that would be a very compelling argument. It would be a hard trade-off, but it would be a pretty logical one.
But he's trying to give the impression that we have a choice between these two, and we don't. The way these things work is that prices decide what gets mined. And so if the deep sea mining operations were to ramp up really quickly and be pretty cost effective, then maybe they would slow the growth of mines in Indonesia, for example. It's hard for me to imagine that that's going to be just like a slam dunk, shut down all the mines. Probably we'll have just both going at the same time.
Even the most optimistic projections don't show terrestrial mining declining in any meaningful way if we start mining from the deep sea. Might be able to slow the expansion, but especially because the economics of deep sea mining are so fraught with all these international hoops to jump through, it's going to be hard to shift the market to the deep sea instead of the rainforest. Okay, there's new developments. Like we were just about to publish this video and something big has happened. First off, Kiribati cut ties with TMC, so they are no longer sponsoring TMC, and apparently they're talking to China about deep sea mining. But the bigger news is that the Trump administration has come out and issued an executive order paving the way for the US to go after deep sea minerals without any approval from the ISA. Wait, wouldn't that be illegal? Technically, depends who you ask. The United States, if you remember, hasn't signed UNCLOS. They're one of the few countries in the world that is not a member nation of the ISA. So yes, this would be illegal under international law. Back in the 1980s, the US passed a law that would technically let US companies apply for licenses to go mine in international waters, not having to go through the ISA. But they've never used it. It's sort of this US policy of being like, we'll play by UNCLOS rules, but we'll have this in our back pocket in case we need it. Well, the Trump administration has deemed that we need it. They need to secure rare earth minerals, and TMC is first in line to apply. This is a huge blow for international maritime law, and it's getting a lot of backlash from the international community. And now I finally understand this moment in this interview that I had with Jared a few months ago when we were talking about the ISA.
And what do you think? Do you think that it is on a track to be the proper regulatory body to make sure that it's done safely and fairly?
It could go either way. And I think people's patience are running out because some of the wrong people are asserting too much control. And they're going to have to be very careful, because if they overplay their hand, then it will be on their watch that lawlessness might come back to the high seas.
Wow.
And he's right. If the US decides to give TMC and other corporations licenses to go mine in the CCZ, this water that most of the world has signed a treaty saying belongs to everyone and that needs to be subject to very specific regulations, if the US does this, then it kind of represents some version of lawlessness. By some technical definition, they would be considered pirates, at least according to those who signed the UNCLOS treaty, which is most countries in the world. So this story, which started out as an interest in Nauru and then got into deep sea mining and ISA regulations, is kind of ending with the US challenging the very basis of international maritime law. Now we wait and see how this little country, this big corporation, and everyone out there teams up to go after these little metal balls. And whether or not that does end up benefiting all mankind, or if, as many fear, this is a repeat of the exploitation and destruction of an ecosystem that has unforeseen effects that will not be good for all mankind, here happening in this piece of ocean that belongs to all of us.